organize this conversation between scholars of eminence. The idea for this webinar came up when I heard that Professor Jan Walsener had received the APA Award for his contribution to international psychology, Division 52. In our conversation about the event, it was evident that Professor Walsener seemed pleased, but in his characteristic style, he was largely preoccupied with his current and forthcoming projects. When he visited our department at the Lady Irwin College almost a decade ago, Dr. Anand Lakshmi, our founder, addressed him with a query. What is your favorite piece among the many publications you have to your credit? With a glint in his eye, he remarked, one that I have not yet written. Dear NAOP members, colleagues, and friends, it is my privilege to introduce Professor Jan Walsener in conversation with Professor Girishwar Mishra and Dr. Parul Bansal. In the interest of time, I will make the introductions brief. Professor Walsener is an Estonian-American developmental and cultural psychologist of Estonian origin. He has been the recipient of the Alexander von Humboldt Prize for his interdisciplinary work on human development, the Hans Killian Award membership of the Estonian Academy of Sciences, and the Niels Bohr Professorship of Cultural Psychology. Currently, he is a professor at Aalborg University in Denmark. In an interview with Gunter May and Katja Mruk, aptly titled A Traveler in Psychology, Professor Walsener describes his perspectives thus. There are many projects going on in parallel, with my involvement in each being variable, and also very variable are specific topics. However, all the projects in some general ways are oriented towards the goal of understanding how human beings are interdependent with their socio-culturally organized environments and how development is possible in this process of interdependence. Professor Jan Walsener has traveled widely to different parts of the world to engage with scholars and has been a visiting professor in Brazil, Japan, Australia, Estonia, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, United Kingdom, and the Netherlands. I'm sure I'm leaving out a few. His collaborations with Japan, China, India, Brazil, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, to name a few, has resulted in proliferating many collaborative projects. Professor Walsener is the founding editor and editor-in-chief of the journal Cultural Psychology by SAGE, the Integrative Psychological and Behavioral Science Journal of Springer, of the Oxford Handbook of Culture and Psychology. He is also the editor of several book series, such as Advances in Cultural Psychology, The Annals of Cultural Psychology with Information Age Publishing, and History and Theory of Psychology with Taylor and Francis, The Cultural Dynamics of Social Representation with Rutledge, and so on. He is also one of the founding editors of the IAP Yearbook of Idiographic Science. Welcome, Professor Walsener. In conversation with him will be the eminent Indian psychologist and former Vice Chancellor of the Mahatma Gandhi Antarashtriya Hindi Vishwavidyalaya, Professor Girishwar Mishra, who has been a leader for the NAOP community and needs no introduction. He has contributed widely to psychology in and about India, locally as well as globally. The latest compendium edited by Professor Mishra is simply titled Psychology, an outcome of the ICSSR initiative to compile research and theoretical scholarship in the social sciences. It is published by OUP in 5 volumes. Professor Mishra writes regularly for the public about issues related to knowledge, wisdom, culture, and tradition. His latest piece on the importance of reviving Sanskrit as a linguistic, cultural, and knowledge resource has been published just last Sunday. It is an honor for us to have him with us today. Providing a different perspective to the conversation, we have with us Dr. Parul Bansal, Assistant Professor at the Lady Shri Ram College, University of Delhi, who will address the opening questions to Professor Walsener. Parul has several publications to her early career, among which the SAGE publication on controversies and debates in psychology is highly recommended. She writes, the relationship between psychology and culture is predicated on two challenging questions. One, how does psychology study culture? And two, an even more radical one, whether psychology itself is a cultural manifestation. The latter question leads us to understand that mainstream psychology is largely an American ethnopsychology shaped by the research concerns, samples, methods of the white middle class, male dominated science. Once this is recognized, psychology's treatment of culture can be placed in context. Thank you for being with us today, Parul. I would also like to introduce Dr. Tushar Singh, Assistant Professor at Banaras Hindu University, Department of Psychology. He is our technical coordinator and advisor for this session. We will start the webinar now with Parul Bansal and Jan Valsena. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chaudhary, for ideating. Thank you, Dr. Chaudhary, for ideating this conversation. I'm grateful to now and to Dr. Tushar for providing us this platform. And Professor Valsena, how does one thank you? It's my complete honor and privilege to be in this conversation with you today. Most of my questions and concerns today, Professor Valsena, are derived from my teaching and research in psychology for over 18 years. What one realizes is that knowledge seeking in mainstream psychology wants to remain uninfluenced by context and also ignores cultural diversity. Thus, mainstream psychology is not only cultural blind, but also culture bound. Now, against this background of psychology's continued denial and ignorance of culture's role, I would like to request you to respond to this question first. That why do you think that psychology must look at culture seriously?
Thank you very much, Parul, and thanks everybody for joining us wherever you are. Good evening, good morning, good night to all of you, wherever you are located. Parul, you raise a wonderful and very difficult question, but let us try to analyze how one could constructively answer it. First of all, if we look at very high-level abstract theoretical way, all human psychological phenomena are context-dependent. There is not a single phenomenon that is outside of the immediate context where it occurs. This can be derived already from what one calls open systemic perspective, where open systems are constantly in interchange with our environments. In this you see in biology, you see it in psychology. We are in constant interchange with other human beings about our being ourselves. So we are inevitably context dependent. So all psychological phenomena of human beings are in this sense cultural phenomena. So far, so simple. It becomes enormously complicated when we start to ask the next question. What do we mean by culture? And here we get into enormous confusion because culture has been used in European discourses as contradiction or contrast between the cultured and the uncultured, which has clearly colonial undertones historically. The culture has been used as in terms of making tools, which is universal perspective, for example, including making language. So our dependence on language is universal all over the world. Languages differ, but we're all dependent on them. And then of course we have the emergence of cross-cultural psychology inside psychology, which has tried to emphasize the notion of culture as almost an analog or synonym to nation state, talking about Estonian culture versus Russian culture and so on. So in all of this gives us enormous confusion about what culture is, and therefore the first answer becomes immediately complicated. So how do we constructively get over it? In different versions, I have tried to say that definition of culture is a hopeless task. The anthropologists up to 1950s already tried it out. They notoriously failed, having devised about 250 definitions of culture. And we can keep doing that and we will fail as well. So maybe it is a better idea to keep the culture as a notion, as a very general label that would separate human from other species, humans from other species, and look very concretely under the label of culture, what could be reasonable to use as a theoretical framework. And here I have developed my own, what I call cultural psychology of semiotic dynamics, which stands out in two ways. One of them is very specific focus on irreversible time in human activities. And secondly, it is exactly the making and sign hierarchies and demolishing the sign hierarchies. And this is, from my point of view, a universalistic look at cultural psychology, which differs very much from, for example, cross-cultural look and so on. So this is my little humble way of trying to solve the very general problem. Will I succeed? I don't know. Who knows? But at least it is an interesting effort.
Surely. Professor Walsener, like what we see in terms of our textbooks, and most of psychology's textbooks are American. In these textbooks, we study culture as an external, independent variable, which impacts upon the psychological constructs like personality and emotion and perception, memory, etc. So culture and psychology are seen as hyphenated entities. What is your take on the hyphenated nature of culture and psyche? Is it useful? Is it problematic? Do we need to overcome this dualism? And if there are any alternatives?
Well, the hyphenated side basically is a reminder to us to consider the different parts of the same whole. For example, when I talk about cultural historical psychology, then I keep the cultural and historical parts together in my thinking. These labels themselves do not solve any of our problems. They may help us to solve some of the problems, or they may keep confusing us. For example, what is the difference between cultural historical psychology, social cultural psychology, and so on? I've been asked that question over and over again, and I cannot answer it. Now, the real issue is actually behind the hyphen. The focus is exactly on the hyphen. The focus is how we put together the social side, for example, and the cultural side in cultural psychology, how we put together the person and the social context where the person inhabits every moment. What are the theoretical tools we could use for that? How do we handle the enormous variability across persons, across societies in all of the different forms? So, and how do you make sense of the creativity, the constructivity of our human minds, which can invent ever new versions of a psyche based on this kind of cultural tools? So these are all the biggest obstacles for us, first of all, theoretically, and only secondarily empirically. When you mention the mainstream psychology and the American textbooks, let us look at the very serious problems that psychology has from my point of view. It has become over-empirical and has abandoned the theoretical precision that, let us say, 40 years ago, 100 years ago, psychology was striving towards. Nowadays, we see psychology sometimes explicitly denying that this theoretical background is needed, turning theory into just a label that is used as an umbrella to cover our empirical efforts, collecting enormous amounts of empirical data which are basically unanalyzed and do not tell us anything about basic problems of the human psyche. So the psychology in this sense is kind of eating itself up by being proudly an empirical science.
Yeah. So when you talk of the need in psychology to be more theoretically grounded and to have good theoretical tools that can sort of look at the interactions between psyche and culture in a more appropriate fashion, in that context, how would you what would be your suggestions about designing a cultural psychological study? Because there too we see a great deal of reductionism, wherein an imported theory or an imported tool is used on an indigenous population, and the study is passed off as a cultural psychological study. So what would be, according to you, the markers and criteria of a good cultural psychological study which is theoretically grounded?
Well, let me give you an example, a contrast which starts from India in the most positive way. The positive way is a very simple reunification of opposites. In 1994, Sinha and Tripathi published a very important chapter emphasizing that the opposition of individualism and collectivism is a false opposition, and that at the level of persons as well as societies, we need to deal with those opposites as mutually connected and present in each and every person and each and every society. They repeated the same message in 2001. All of this should lead our cross-cultural psychology away from the simple comparing of samples from this and other society to a serious analysis of unity of the opposites of collectivism and individualism in the person and in society. Has that happened? No. So the problem of psychology is not listening to the theoretical voices that emerge from time to time. So it's very easy to come out from the Indian context to actually see the limitations of the Western Occidental psychology, because the basis is basically very limited. It's not wrong, but it's limited. It's limited to individualistic focus, separated from the context again. So it makes a contextual separation, and they say, oh, we need to reinvent the context. And of course, we do not. So why not start already from what is there? That means every moment is contextualized in our meaning systems in any society, and build a very viable set of questions about how this particular relation develops, how it can be emphasized, supported, or blocked at the same way. So that would be my solution to some of these very difficult questions.
So you suggest beginning from emic concepts and realities which are grounded in the culture.
They are grounded in the culture, and they are more importantly grounded in the psychological aspects of the person, who is, of course, using from my point of view, the semiotic devices to create the psychological phenomena. So all human psychological phenomena are cultural phenomena in the sense of that they are mediated by signs. And therefore, we start from the sign-mediated personal phenomena, personal phenomenology, and move to the analysis of how different signs and how personal intentions are become combined in the life of a human being. So it's a kind of a synthesis of a personological focus with a semiotic focus in this kind of psychology.
I see. And what kind of methods would you suggest that can be used? Would you think that cultural psychological studies are completely incompatible with quantitative researches, quantitative methods of data collection and analysis?
Well, back in 1930, in his autobiography, the American developmental thinker James Mark Baldwin made a very bold comment. He said something like, quantitative methods should be basically eliminated from psychology because they eliminate the phenomena exactly when they are becoming applied. I'm not quoting exactly now, but he arrived at the very end of his career, after trying to develop developmental logic and kind of getting halfway there. And what they said was quite important and continues to be important here. Quantification in psychology is a particular example of how American-based psychology is indigenous psychology. Quantification is not science. Quantification comes out of a business ethos of American society's history from already early 19th century, long before psychology became using any quantification. It has nothing to do with guaranteeing the scientific status of psychology. It is a tool. Quantification is one of the possible tools which is applicable in some conditions. But we have to first specify which conditions. And this is usually not done. If you can specify where it is applicable, very nice. If not, then you are creating artificial data. And as a result of that, of course, one would say that most of psychology's quantitative data are basically artifacts which have no longevity. They're indications of very hard work, but they are not indications of breakthroughs. And what psychology needs is breakthroughs, not hard work.
At this point, Parul, do you have?
Yes, I have one more question, and then I. Okay. What you said about all of psychology being indigenous is a very radical position and also a very welcome one. I think we need to really take that very seriously. However, I would like you to consider a specific problem that ail indigenous psychologies across the world, and that is a kind of uncritical revivalism of the ancient past, and creating hegemonic descriptions of cultural understandings in much the same way like the Occident does of us, or the Orientals. So do you think that cultural psychology should be simultaneously also a critical psychology, critiquing the principles which are emanating from either the West or the East, that are hegemonizing the East?
I treat cultural psychology as general psychology. It's not all psychology is general psychology. I would say that cultural psychology is a general psychology of human living, of human beings. We will also have comparative psychology, which has nothing to do with notions of meaning, semiosis, and so on, but it's very important to the understanding of psychological organization of different human species. Not physiological psychology, but exactly comparative psychology in the sense of what we saw 100 years ago, more or less. These two areas would be general psychology, that one of them is for human beings, the other is about other species. So that's but the basic issue is exactly the axiomatic basis for psychology. You pointed out very important issue here, that it need not start from the axioms of the Occidental societies. It is probably better off starting from a combination of different cultural backgrounds of, for example, Orient and Occident together, because they are not actually very different. They're just different versions of the derivations from one another. So there is a clear possibility to build a general science which is not dismissive of differences between human beings or societies, but at the same time helps us to understand all of them.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you very much, Parul. Thank you, Professor Valsana. We now transition to Professor Girishwar Mishra, a conversation between Professor Girishwar Mishra and Professor Jan Valsana. Over to you.
Jan, I would like to congratulate you on this occasion and share my joy with you and colleagues from India. For the last more than 25 years, you have been struggling with issues pertaining to culture and psychology. I think it was 1995 when you started the journal, Culture and Psychology. And in the course of your academic travel, the concern for meaning has been central. And what I have found is that you have tried to relate to personal and collective processes in meaning making, and you are fond of using the notion of co-construction. The recent volume on socio-cultural psychology is one great example of the efforts which come from different parts of the world. We would like to understand from you, and it will be useful for the audience, that what are the theoretical and methodological implications of co-construction that you are trying to bring in the course of developing socio-cultural psychology.
Yeah, thank you, Girish. That is a very important question, exactly in the heart of the matter. The co-construction notion is, of course, another hyphenated term.
Yeah.
So, and the question is, who is a co? If I am constructing, I am the constructor, who is a co-constructor? And first co-constructor is, of course, myself in my own development. I am constantly negotiating with myself as I am moving ahead in my own life, everything that I have lived through and everything I'm about to live through. The second co-constructor is a social other, very clearly. So we are coordinating the two co-construction processes within myself and within the social other. The social other takes very many different forms. It can be a real person. It can be a memory of a person. My social other can be my grandfather, whose memory I carry with me. It can be an idealized picture of somebody in the future, so to say. It can be a person who is next to me right in my life, whom I meet in the corner kiosk when I go to buy something in the street. So these are all examples of real social others. It can also be a social institution that comes to me in the form of a policeman delivering me some message which I'm afraid of, because a policeman wears a uniform, for example, and so on. So in this sense, a co-construction is a constantly ongoing meaning construction at the intersection of all of these different social others, including myself. This leads us theoretically to very interesting questions, which is, it is not the question of, quote, one variable having an impact, quote, on another variable. It's a question of coordination of the different ongoing processes. We need a terminology to deal with this coordination. There is nowadays inside, or partly inside cultural psychology, the effort to develop dialogical self-theory, which in principle sets the stage for this, looking at this coordination. But it has not managed to deal with the notion of the coordinated processes. It has managed to deal with coordinated positions of developing a multiple look at the self, but not exactly at the ongoing processes, which is a possibility. So in this sense, this kind of looking at polyphonic construction of my own meaning system at the intersection of these various co-constructor allies would be exactly what my perspective entails.
Great. It opens many issues for psychological inquiry. I would like to pursue it further. In this meaning-making process, you are bringing in a different kind of framework, and how we can go to see the variations in cultural and personal cultures. You have frequently referred to personal culture and the social part of that. So how we pursue it? Psychologists have created a number of issues. How we are going to deal with this process of managing meaning and working with this and coordinate. Can you elaborate further?
Yes, well, I introduced the notion of personal culture versus collective culture as a duo, as a duality, not a dualism, but as a duality. So exactly to emphasize the central role of the person in the making of one's meanings. So to say, the personal culture is therefore my personal meaning system that I have created and I am creating together with all the other co-creators, co-constructors, but it is mine, it is built around me, it is carried by me anywhere I go. But at the same time, of course, it enters into different relations with different other people's personal cultures, form a collective culture locally. Collective culture is not society. Collective culture is exactly the social immediate context within which a person creates one's meaning system. For example, let us say Indian joint family system could be exactly that. It can be any kind of particular network of friends, kinship network, and so on, to come to the anthropological side of it. This is all the domain for the collective cultural development. On top of that, we have the societal organization, which sets up different expectations for regulating personal culture, collective culture relations. So, and this is, so in this sense, we're talking of three layers of system: personal culture, collective culture, and societal implications. So it means something, what you alluded to already. It means that each and every personal cultural organization is unique. When you make that claim, you are making a very important claim. All psychological phenomena are unique phenomena. Therefore, you have to generalize from uniqueness rather than repetition. Each and every psychological phenomenon, each and every specific way of giving meaning to something here and now, based on, for example, my relationship with somebody else. Somebody has given me a gift and I appreciate that gift exactly because of that somebody. The somebody's meaning of that somebody, other person, is magnifying the relevance of the gift for me. So this has to be understood in general terms on the basis of a single instance. Not single case even, but single instant in time. This is a very tough requirement for epistemology. Basically, psychologists are not used to it, at least for some decades. Linguists are doing it all the time because for them the critical point is one particular utterance, sentence, and so on. So they are used to it. Paleoanthropologists do it even more because they do not have full evidence of the phenomena they are looking at. Astronomers do it because objects they study are far away and unique. So you don't have a sample of Marses to study, you have only one out there, to which it takes some time to fly. So this is all the methodological and kind of epistemological implications that follow from my version of cultural psychology. It's a headache, I must admit. It's not an easy solution.
Great. Psychologists in general are preoccupied with selecting a set of variables, sometimes randomly, sometimes, because they are interested in one kind of theory. And the contrast that I find with your approach which brings in meaning to the center stage, I mean, the whole requirement of doing good psychology will require reflection, attending to phenomenology, looking at a different epistemological basis. Uh, how do you think that the academic practice that we have, where we just engage with more and more variables without making any kind of addition to knowledge or understanding, it's a chaotic situation because the empirical world is changing every day. And n number of things are happening, and you add variables and you hardly make any sense of that. And if you look at developments in any subdisciplines of psychology or any theme, you find so many theories depending on different, well, metaphors, depending on different specific theoretical preferences. Now, it's a chaotic situation. You can't even follow the super specialities which are happening. Now we are bringing in a meaning, where to start, how to introduce this new approach to psychological understanding. Once upon a time, when psychology was more interested in consciousness, in the inside, then, well, there were few things. But when you have gone out, you have taken behavior, you have taken whole environment, so things have become very, very complex. And if we take meaning into account, which seems to be central to the whole activity, whole business of psychology, are you trying to build a theoretical and methodological framework to come out of this rut, to come out of this preoccupation with empirical variations? I would like to understand from you that what approaches seem to be appropriate to help us in this situation.
Let me try to answer it with a slightly historical point of view. We start from years 1780s, 1790s, and from Immanuel Kant, who obviously has been in the background of Occidental science in a very powerful way. He denied the possibility of scientific status to two disciplines. One was psychology, the other was chemistry. Well, if Kant were alive today, I think he will still insist on that claim about psychology, but he would probably have to accept that chemistry has managed to become a science. Why so? What has happened differently in chemistry that has not happened in psychology? Around 1830s, chemistry invented multiple levels of formal languages that allowed chemistry to perform experiments without reducing the complexity of the to say, theoretical background to the complexity of the chemical empirical background. This moved chemistry decisively away from alchemy, which was its predecessor. In 1909, Wilhelm Ostwald got the Nobel Prize for the very simple idea of catalysis, which implies that not all chemical actions are causal, but some of them simply require the presence of catalysts for a reaction to happen. Psychology has not accepted the notion of catalysts. It is in our volume from 2013 where we systematically bring the notion of catalysis to psychology. Catalysis allows us to start treating different characteristics of psychological kind in two categories. Some may be causal, very few. Most are catalytic, very many. It doesn't allow us to reduce the complexity you mentioned, but it allows us to organize the complexity a little better. 23 years ago, Angela Branco from Brazil and I developed what we call the methodology cycle. It's a cycle which basically looks at how do we construct methods for what kind of phenomena, emphasizing that phenomena always come first. This is a point I made to answer Parul's question before already. But also that a specific meta-level axiomatic background narrows down what kind of questions are worthwhile asking and how to ask them. And this leads us to the notion that most questions that are worth to be asked are qualitative. Therefore, we are using qualitative methods as a norm, and quantification is one form of qualitative method, simply, not the other way around. So, and secondly, of course, that we look at the notion of the phenomena in development. So all of these two lead us to narrow down on what kind of critical questions are reasonable to ask in empirical domain. So with all of that, we are making some efforts, but of course, this is very far from being elaborated. The obstacles that is there is exactly what Parul mentioned before, is also the notion of borrowing textbooks from other countries. Psychology teaching happens very much as a colonial enterprise from one country or some certain countries to other countries. Unless this is reversed, unless it's equalized, psychology cannot develop beyond what Kant was basically predicting for it. So it's not a very good answer to what your question, but it's at least half answer, I would say.
Yeah, it's interesting. At this point, we can look at the relationship between cultural psychology and indigenous psychology. You know, in different cultural settings, there are symbolic resources, cultural practices, which are quite diverse. Cultural psychology, again, it is not a uniformly used term, because there are many meanings of cultural psychology. We find variation, and it's unfortunate that what we call mainstream psychology is nothing but largely American or Euro-American psychology. So how we see the relationship between cultural psychology and indigenous psychology?
Well, indigenous psychology is an important development of recent decades that allows us to widen our meaning system to understand the differences between different societies and different persons. We can talk about indigenous psychology even in an immediate interpersonal context. So my personal culture is a form of indigenous psychology as well, if we can widen the term in this way. So the same issue of seeing universality and diversity comes into being. From my point of view, if a cultural psychology is a really universal discipline, then it has to be equally adequate to understand indigenous psychological issues somewhere in any part of the world, as well as mine in the European or North American context. So there's, in this sense, no difference. There is no difference in the general mechanisms. There is a big difference in the particular meanings that are being used in different places. So again, you see that the abstract level of argumentation, theoretical build-up, is driving us towards looking at universal science, whereas empirical side will always necessarily be sensitive to the local context, the local contextual specificities of each of the phenomena. So that would be my solution to this, that is simultaneously build high abstract theoretical schemes, which are at the same time can be contextualized in any particular social context, including those of what indigenous psychologists have indicated up to now as different from the Occidental psychology.
Yeah, it's very important to see the implications of colonization, and India is an example of that. Training and the pedagogical practices,
Yeah.
conceptual frameworks were borrowed from Western practices.
Yeah.
And psychology started in India in 1916. The modern psychology, and one of the students of Munsterberg, who was trained at Harvard, Dr. Anand Gupta, took almost similar framework, similar questions, the textbook, the entire material, academic material was transported, and with full commitment, all those things were started without relating them to the cultural context. I see a possibility in looking at the resources available from indigenous perspective to decolonize the processes. How do you think about it? The kind of relationship between the process of decolonization and the study of indigenous cycle.
The decolonization is quite important, and it really, the unification of the psychological know-how depends exactly on decolonizing almost all sides of it, so to say, basically leaving the colonial background into the historical context, and at the same time taking over new opportunities, new possibilities where human beings enter, new specific, for example, new technologies. We are basically captivated by our new technologies, but our psychological buildup remains very similar. We make meaning of new objects in our everyday life worlds, but the new objects are all coming in as new technologies worldwide. So to say, a cell phone anywhere in the world is a new object that enters into the psychological buildup of personal cultures, whether it is Occident, Orient, or anywhere else.
Yeah, that's true. I have one more question from my side, and that is about the state of knowledge in psychology. What I have gathered from your works, you are an exceptional person who is keenly interested in understanding psychological phenomena from a perspective which is quite open. You try different ways. You are empirical at the same time you attend to phenomenology. You are interested in empirical processes. At the same time, you are interested in meaning. So what is your assessment of the current state of psychology and its ability to understand the lived experience and its place in, the domain of knowledge forms which are available, and how far it is capable to understand our problems and solve our problems? How do you think about it?
Yeah, how to understand the living experience. It starts from, again, our psychology organizing how we as psychologists look at that living experience. We agreed before our meeting today not to mention any viruses here, but I want to introduce a new virus. Let
Sure.
us call this new virus ACV21. ACV21. It's an administrative conformity virus of 21st century. Its specific form comes from my experience with students in different countries, United States, Europe, where the students whom are discussing issues of life and how to study their living experience suddenly ask me, are we allowed to use this method? Or are we allowed to think in this way? The focus here is on the notion allowed. Who allows a person to think? The administrative system that is somewhere in the background of our teaching of psychology leads us to young people who are insecure about whether they can ask new questions, whether they can ask him in new ways. And that is actually a big obstacle towards making us to understand the lived through world. I am sure that this can be overcome. Most of the very young psychologists are very eager to exactly explore the lived-in world. But they have to overcome the particular socialization effort of this ACV 21.
Thank you. I think we need to think about freedom of thought,
Yes,
autonomy.
exactly. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Girish.
Thank you very much, Professor Mishra. And with your permission, Jan, I think I will go on to the questions. They are piling up. So sorry, but there may be some viruses in the questions. I hope you are open to that.
Yeah, sure.
So the first question addressed to you is, greetings, Professor Jan Valsena. In this era, I think youth are more inclined towards individualism, and perhaps she's talking about Indian youth more specifically, that they're becoming more inclined towards individualism. What is your take about post-pandemic times? Do you think that the youth are going to be more likely towards commercial invention of identity rather than a culturally grounded sense of identity? Taking cross-cultural youth psychology into consideration.
Well, this is a good question because this allows us to elaborate the previously asked questions of how to study this phenomenon. I cannot answer the question more or less because this is a question of very generic kind, but I can answer the question, how can we go to study exactly the particular tension between commercialized and basically circumscribed or prescribed ways of how one should think in our society versus a construction of novelty that comes from our own cultural background, personal cultural backgrounds. This is a tension indeed, and the tension is there that is navigated and is resolved in each and every young person. So you can see the person's always resisting some of the social suggestions. The resistance is a central part of human development, not lack of development, but exactly resistance is part of the development. So as a result of this, you would probably see a number of different trajectories in the handling of new superimposed ways of feeling in a new society and new versions of society. Some of them would actually create a new version based on that is suggested from others, and others would simply follow what is being suggested to them in the commercial world. So the consumer orientation that you see all over the world developing societally is a basic input into the personal constructions of meaning of persons. So this is inevitable. This is cannot be avoided. It can only be studied as it is going by. How am I feeling in constructing my absolutely unique personal world out of objects that are all mass-produced?
Right. Thank you. Harpreet, I hope that addresses your question. We move now to a question from Robert Serpel in Lusaka, who asks, given the thorough critique of Skinner's behaviorism by Chomsky and other pioneers of the cognitive revolution in the 1960s, why is it that mainstream psychology, that is weird nation indigenous psychology, continues to overemphasize empirical research and largely neglects or denies the fundamental importance of theory?
Thank you, Robert. This is a very, very good question. And I have been thinking of it already two decades at the least. And I think that the answer to your question is actually extra scientific. When you look at individual psychologists trying to make sense of something they can be quite open-minded about how to build a theory, how to deal with empirical evidence, how to build experiments, how to go to the right place to look at the relevant empirical data. So this is all quite creative in the individual level. But when it comes to the level of institutional organization of psychology, all of the specific system of values that is added to specific aspects of what you study, how you study, what to write into a grant application in order to get funded, and so on. This is basically the institutional sieve or institutional filter that maintains mainstream psychology in its particular practices. And to separate them scientific side, which is that of the psychologists themselves trying to solve the problems, and then the need for resources that is very heavily limited by the institutional rule systems. I think at the intersection of that, we have an answer to the very slow development and maybe even the opposite development of what is needed in the mainstream practices. We can criticize mainstream forever, even never knowing what it actually is. But the background societal system that makes it live in its particular strengths is not altered by our critique.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Professor Valsner. Thank you, Robert Serpil, for your question. We have a question from another person in our audience, a second Harpreet, who asks, Professor Valsner, could you elaborate on Occidental and Oriental differences on how individuals' imaginations are shaped by culture?
Well, I would treat the psychological systems of both Oriental and Occidental based people as similar. What is happening in the Occidental world is certain extra constraints are put upon the particular imagination. These extra constraints start from focusing of individual rather than at the individual and others relation. The moment you take these constraints away in a, let us say, European context, nobody would doubt that the relevance of the interpersonal relations is very central. But from the point of view of thinking about particular issue, for example, the self, this becomes, a constraint becomes very clear, the imagination of the self. My Japanese colleague Koji Komatsu has introduced a new theory of self, which is built exactly at the intersection of person and the societal experience. The Western psychology has very hard time understanding his argument. So you see the difficulty even at the theoretical level to deal with systemic and field-like phenomena, systemic phenomena that are very closely connected with everyday life activities, but at the very same time, very abstract. This is somehow in the background of our discipline.
Right. This idea of the self being at the intersection of the individual and society is very comfortable for us. We wouldn't have any problem in accepting such a position on the construction or the co-construction of the self.
Yeah, well, this indicates very clearly that actually the phenomenological basis for universal psychology needs to start from not just one, but basically many Oriental countries with their historical experiences, and treats the European North American versions as an interesting exception. Basically reversing the pattern. And it's not very difficult because you can very easily see, extend collective orientation that takes different forms in different societies, from Oriental societies to Occidental ones, and look at the remnants of it right there, so to say. So in other sense, you start with a wider theoretical lens, coming to look at the specific phenomena. That is why I have been very interested in Indian phenomena over 20 years, working from distance, working on India long before I ever came to India. It's exactly because the phenomena that I trace from afar in India provide me with a wider mindset, which I myself may have not had in the European background.
Mhm, mhm. We shift a little bit from identity, selfhood, and construction to materiality. This is a question from Ramiro. Uh, what place does materiality or substantiality of the material object involved have in that co-construction? What kind of participation or orientation does the materiality dimension of the physical objects impose?
Well, the materiality side is everywhere, starting from our bodies, meaning making about our bodies, as well as creating all of the personal culture. The substantiality side is a little bit more complicated. I would consider it as something we build on the materiality in very concrete ways. The example of a gift that I mentioned before is one of these, in my understanding. So surely it is there. The question is, how do we exactly put them into our theoretical schemes? That is really the issue. The world is there as it is in its whole complexity, but when something is very complex, it means we are probably looking at the wrong level of analysis. Because we need to differentiate different levels of analysis so that we have a simpler picture from afar and very complex picture very close.
The next question, Professor Mishra, is addressed to you as well. Is Professor Mishra with us? So the question is that what is the most theoretically sound conceptualization of the vast concept of culture according to both professors? What can be said about the geographical view of culture? Is it only limited to that? So basically addressing what is the conceptual, from your perspective, what is the theoretically most sound way of conceptualizing the notion of culture? Professor Mishra, you want to go first?
The concept of culture has received attention from psychologists in different ways, and it has given entry at different levels. In fact, our methodology has provided scope to do that some people use culture as an independent variable. Another stage is that you take culture as a resource to generate hypotheses, theories, and notions, and then you unpack that and you study that. One approach is that culture consists of meanings and processes which are socially shared by a group, by a community, and that way it has some link with geographical notion, and the boundaries are there. You have once upon a time a notion of cult units that you with the help of language differences and other things, you create. You also make distinctions in subjective culture and objective culture and projective culture. All sorts of things are there. The important thing is that a given community has relationship with its past, and that relationship can be of various kinds. For example, in India, modern youth has no understanding of the scriptures, the concepts and theories and notions. Somehow or other, they are present in certain ways in the life practices, rituals, and they may be shared in different ways. So I think meaning construction is one component of culture, how we take into account within understanding of psychological processes. And I think that psychology is located within the cultural context. Uh, uh, what we have tried is that we have tried to take culture within psychology in terms of methodology at some point. We have not taken that seriously, and particularly in the Indian context, it becomes very, very difficult because there are epistemological, ontological considerations, very rich considerations, and they allow you to pursue certain kinds of inquiries. If you take yoga as a system of knowledge, not only merely the asanas and practices, it has a theory of consciousness, it has a theory of emotion and whatnot. For example, the whole analysis of emotion is available in the Indian context, very rich, very detailed. Now, we hardly bother about that. So I think in particular context of India, the limited knowledge that we have is that many of these resources are there, but they are unexamined. They are not available to us. They are not used in our analysis. So in one sense, the availability of resources of various kinds of symbolic and in terms of practices, in terms of values, they need to be understood. They need to be appreciated and how they can be used. We are not clear about our standard notion of culture in psychology. For different people, it has meant different things. To a large extent, cross-cultural psychology was mere an attempt to see how a Western concept is used in a different cultural setting.
Right.
So you take a concept and you see its presence in different cultures. So you talk about ethic and you talk about emic, you talk about even derived ethic, that you begin with emic and then ultimately you reach to universal psychological principles and theories. So I don't think there is any immediate resolution which is acceptable to everybody within the discipline of psychology, that this is the meaning of culture. To a large extent, it is quite variable, and it takes different positions in different schools of thought. So it is quite open. And I think it requires more serious analysis. And whether you need culture, it is still not taken into account in any standard textbook of psychology. When you talk about basic processes, they are independent of culture.
Right. Right.
It's
You
a
have
peculiar situation.
right. Uh, Professor Balsina, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I fully concur with what was just said. That is, first of all, the need for openness is extremely important in cultural psychology. And secondly, that specification is very important to understand what do we mean by that. In my own way, what I do both. As an editor of culture and psychology, I make sure that no single theoretical direction would dominate a particular journal as such. It has to be an open forum for different particular perspectives in cultural psychology, even if they may be different from mine. And at the very same time, I narrow my own perspective to the meaning making very strictly to the construction of sign hierarchies in the irreversible time. So the notion of irreversible time is a starting point for looking at semiotic constructivity, constructing of sign hierarchies. And this is, in a way, a very narrow definition of culture from my point of view. I need it narrow in order to ask further questions.
So you mean sign, as in S-I-G, symbol?
Yes, sign that stands for something. In Peirce's notion of something that stands for something else, but this something that stands for something else is constructed constantly in the meaning-making process and unconstructed at the same time. And I am very narrow in this kind of use of culture, recognizing others being much wider and much more elaborate.
Right. Before we go on to further questions, I want to just check in with Tushar. Tushar, it's 6:10 now, and can we take a few more questions, or should we try to, because there are a lot of interesting questions. How about if I take, Tushar is perhaps busy, how about if I take another couple of questions? I'm trying to combine some of the questions to make sure that we address everyone's issues.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I think we can go up to 15-20 minutes more.
Okay. So after the question answer session, we have a surprise presentation by Tushar, which I will signal to you to put on. But before we get to that, I just want to address a question. One is by an anonymous attendee and one is by Ankita. And I'm going to try to combine both of them because I think there are some similar points where when we're talking about the complexity and intricacy of external and internal spheres of exploration, the anonymous attendee asks, does culture require the existence of human relationships? What is the bare minimum component of a culture to exist?
Well, I would say the minimum component is a turning of a particular object into a meaningful one. The best example is you are walking on a seashore. There are many little stones on that beach you are walking. You take one of them and take it back home as a memory from that visit to the seashore. This is a minimum act of culture from my point of view. You have taken an object, a material object from the ground, one of the very, very many that are there on the beach. You carry it home and you look at it at home as your memory of that experience on that beach, so to say. Absolutely minimum because it's one stone. Right. Absolutely maximum because it's your complete experience from that day out on the beach.
Right. Thank you. That it's a very evocative example, and I hope this answers the question. In a sense, Saifur Rahman Farooqi asks a slightly different question, and here he's addressing the issue of indigenization of psychology. In a country where there are so many plural traditions, where there are so many different perspectives that one can take, can indigenization of psychology, how does it deal with socio-political influences? And how do you make sure that one culture doesn't dominate, culture here in quotes, one tradition does not dominate? So how does one indigenize perspectives, I mean, into an Indian indigenous perspective?
Well, let me start from the end of the question. How do we guarantee that one social agent, let us call him social agent, does not dominate another? As we know, in all societies over all history, the act of domination has been constantly being there. If it's not there, it is being created. And very often it's created by symbolic signs, means, so to say. So probably the way to avoid this happening is twofold. First of all, resistance. That is, I refuse to accept the meaning of the other telling me something or giving me and secondly, of course, collaboration or coordination of different perspectives. Namely, for example, basically neutralizing this kind of non-equality focus by making it vanish in the societal collaboration between different agents, between people. So the negotiation of equality rather than avoidance of non-equality. Now, how it comes into the Indian context in indigenization side, this is for me at this moment very difficult to answer because I lack the direct experience somewhere in the middle of India, somewhere in the so-called scheduled castes, and their particular concerns about the environment, for example. I can have some glimpse of it from Brazil, but it is not the same, of course. So, but basically, the specific innovations that people bring in their particular indigenous lifestyle, together with a change of the lifestyle, this can be seen as meaning constructions in different directions. And now I fail to answer further. I don't know how to answer the question, which directions, how are they created, and so on. This requires knowledge I don't have.
Right. Thank you so much for at least taking on the question. I do think these questions are important to ask to make sure that we do not repeat the cycle of domination within, endless cycles of, it is collaboration that you focused on, which is the productive side of difference. I think I'm going to make this the last question because I think there are, we don't want to exhaust our audience either. But this comes, so I apologize to others. I'm sure Professor Jan Valsena will be very happy. He's very open, very responsive on email. So if you have pressing questions, please address them to Professor Valsena. But I take on this last question, which is, do you think that assigning characteristics to a culture promotes a disregard for heterogeneity and minimizes the role of the individual? If yes, then how can it be addressed? First of all, do you agree? Do you think that assigning characteristics promotes disregard for heterogeneity?
Assign promotes disregard.
No, assigning characteristics. Indians are like that.
Oh, okay, I see. Well, this is a perennial problem at the intersection of individual subject-related general psychology and sample-based general psychology. How many individuals would make up a basis for this kind of a generalization, so to say? And my answer is that the question cannot have an answer. It's a locally created answer. Let us say 95% must be there, 2 persons must be there, and 1 person is enough. It has no answer. So the question is probably something else. What is the function of these kinds of statements for the meaning construction of an individual who creates it? So to say, I say all Estonians are silly, for example, being an Estonian myself. So what am I doing by making that little statement? I am creating an artificial border between myself, an Estonian, and all other Estonians. Yeah? It's not a statement about Estonians, it's a statement about myself.
Right.
So think of that when you encounter so many statements about Indians are like that, Russians are like that, Americans are like that. Immediately questions is, about whom is the statement?
Thank you so much, Professor Valsena, for this conversation. And for a brief moment, I deeply apologize to all that we have so many really interesting questions there. And I think you can access them and take a look quickly to see if later you want to think about these issues. They emerge from a wide audience that we have today. So I want to now hand over the mic to Tushar for a very brief presentation, which is a surprise, kind of fun ending to our conversation. And then Tushar from there will do a quick thank you address to everybody. So over to you, Tushar.
Thank you, ma'am. So, dear audience, I'm sure you would have heard and got to know one aspect of Professor Walsner. Here I'm going to present something very interesting which will take you to the other more versatile part of him and would definitely tell you about his interest and the real personality he has. Here it is. I am sure this presentation is visible.
Yes.
Okay, so let us see how he is in other than his academic domain. So when we try to ask him who he is, he say, I don't know. But let us try to understand what Professor Walsner is actually. So we can see the child in him, which we all miss nowadays as we grow up. But Professor Walsner has somehow remained to be what he actually is. He's a wonderful flute player, by the way. He can make flute of anything.
गन्ने का बांसुरी बना.
Yes. So this was very brief. We had a lot to show and tell about Professor Walsner, but we keep it open for all of you to get a time to interact with Professor Walsner whenever you get a chance. And I'm sure he is such an open person that he accept and respond to anybody who approach him with question, concerns, comments, and all. Now, at the end of this, it's my pride, privilege, and opportunity to thank you all for being here. Professor Walsner, many thanks for you to be here on this now platform. And we are well aware that you are always available for us, the psychologists in India. You have a great connection with us, and I thank you on the behalf of the entire psychology community of India, on the behalf of National Academy of Psychology, and my own personal behalf that you taken out of your precious time and was here with us to answer some of the critical questions that has emerged today out of the discussion. I would also like to thank Professor Girishwar Misra sir, who is one among the founding figure of the National Academy of Psychology and a well-known academician and critical thinker of psychology in India. Thank you, sir, for being here with us. Without your presence, this conversation would have not achieved so much interest. in the audience. I also thank you, Parul, for being here with us, representing the young minds in India, young psychologists like us, and taking out some of the very crucial questions that always emerges in the mind of young psychologists like us, but majority of the time it remains within us due to many inhibitions and many other reasons. Thank you, Parul. I would also like to thank Nandita ma'am for organizing this wonderful event. It was her initiative and idea to make it a conversation rather than a lecture. Thank you, ma'am, for your creative and very effective organization of this program. We hope that we will be able to organize more such wonderful creative events in future on our platforms.
आप बुलाओगे हम करेंगे.
Definitely, ma'am. आपको बुलाना क्या है? You are the part of Indian psychology community. Invite क्या करना है? I would like to thank.
That's my privilege. Thank you so much.
I would also like to thank all 350 plus registrants who shown interest in this program. 100 participants who were lucky to join us on the web Zoom platform, and many others who were there on Facebook live streaming. And there are few who already communicated that due to network problem, they are usually not able to participate in live programs, but are always, they see it on now YouTube link. I thank you all with the deepest of my heart, because it's you whose initiation and encouragements keep us moving and thinking about variety of programs on Now platform. I would also take this opportunity to announce that we are soon going to have a live panel discussion on new education policy of India sometime between August 11th to 15th. The program schedule will be circulated once it is finalized, and I hope to see you all again there in that program. I also like to thank all NAOP officers, advisors, and all other associated with NAOP who have entrusted us with the responsibility of organizing this event. And finally, I thank you all once again and would like your blessings and your permission to end the session with joy and glory.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much. I have learned very much from your questions, and I look forward to direct contact. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Mishra sir, can I end the session now?
Sure.
Thank you all. Bye-bye. Stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Bye.